We're told to work hard to become independent and successful in life, but we're also told to give joyfully and not cling to the things we work so hard to get. God reminds us that everything is His. We are entrusted on this earth with time, talent, and treasures. In this podcast, we learn to live as Jesus teaches.
Well, it's good to be back together. This is Steve Wood. I'm the lead pastor of Mount Pisgah, and I'm here with two very wise disciples of Jesus, Ray Bachman and Duane Wood. And we have been venturing into how God is moving to teach us how to trust God. Thus, the title of the podcast, Entrusted by God. And we have shared some of our personal stories. I'll refer you to the earlier podcast if you have not yet heard those. They're all about 20 minutes, and the stories are really good, and I appreciate Ray and Duane and their vulnerability in sharing those. Today, we wanted to dive in a little deeper in terms of both understanding biblical teaching and then, quite honestly, sharing the struggle of trying to apply it when it comes into the context of questions like, how much is enough? Or maybe biblically, it would be, all right, how do we pursue, accept, and embrace contentment rather than covetousness? And so, we delve into the 10 Commandments of the Old Testament, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 6. There are those now who think the Old Testament maybe is not as relevant as it once was. I'm not one of those. I believe it's divinely inspired, as Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3. But in that list of 10 commandments, there is a very clear commandment: thou shalt not covet. That's what's in the King James Version. Probably a better way to say it these days is said by the author of the book Death by Suburb: do not covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's life, your neighbor's car, your neighbor's lawn, your neighbor's achievements. And so there's some unsettling around venturing into the sin of coveting stuff, things, or getting caught up in some kind of comparative study with those around us. Now, you weigh that against the passage that you've been thinking about, Duane, and that's out of Philippians 4 on contentment. Why don't you share that with us?
I will. Philippians 4, 11 and 12. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer. That's the New King James Version.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the key to this here that we see here, Paul tells us, is it's learned. So contentment is something that is a learned behavior, because covetousness comes natural. We don't have to be taught to covet. We are taught, we know how to covet the minute we come out of a womb. And I'm reminded every time one of my new grandbabies comes along and it's mine. I want it.
Mm-hmm.
So naturally we covet, but we have to learn to be content. So this is a learned skill.
And so a part of that, the learning part of that is like, there's the human moral development, like you talk about in your grandchildren, but then there's the whole spiritual element of following Christ in this context of that which is entrusted unto us by God, and learning to be content with how we're living with our time and our treasure and our relationships. Man, that's a slow learn. Wouldn't you agree?
I definitely think contentment is a struggle. Of course, being in North Fulton, which is a very affluent area, there's always somebody, like you said, Pastor, with bigger, better, nicer, this, that, or whatever. And I think that's why it goes back to the basics of living within our means and living on budgets. Because I know I've had friends before that said, Bachman, why do you drive what you drive? You could afford this, that, or the other. I said, well, it just doesn't fit in our budget. And they're like, what are you talking about? And so, again, we talked about guardrails, and I think guardrails can protect us from making unwise decisions, because it only takes a few bad decisions financially to really, I guess the saying goes, reap what we sow. And I've seen people in the past make bad financial decisions that probably been outside their financial scope, and it's affected them in many ways. So again, contentment kind of runs deeper than just dollars and cents. It also can impact our time and where we spend, a lot of our efforts. I know even in the neighborhood, we talked about sports activities, kids activities, parents' involvements. I mean, these days it seems like families go in 10 different directions. And sometimes we think in order to be content, we need to be involved in all these different, activities. Mm-hmm. And so again, guardrails, I think, is the key. And just being content, say, you know what, we're not going to get involved in too many things as a family. As a parent, as kids, we're going to really be a family. We're going to watch our finances. We're not going to get stretched and be on the edge because we can't afford what we have. So I think this is a great topic, and it's real and it's hard. And it's not like all of a sudden we just wave our pixie dust and everything's better. I think it's a daily battle and a daily decision of choices.
So what do you think? There's 4 things that I can think of that make up contentment, or the way you learn contentment. And we'll describe each one of them, and then let's take them one at a time and talk about them in a little bit of depth. But
sure.
First one is trust God. And this is for our 419 folks out there and 4 calls. Trust, lordship is a key component of being a disciple. And so you got to trust God. You got to thank God. Second thing I would say was you've got to thank God. You've got to be thankful for the breath you draw, for the fact that we are here and alive. We've got to thank God for those blessings that we have, the gift of life. Third thing I would say would be love. You've got to learn to love others. And when you do that, that's going to bring out the contentment in you. And the last thing, not the last thing, but it's the one thing that's actively that we can do that probably stings the most to those starting off, but is the wonderful thing to learn contentment, is to become generous, to be a giver. How about?
Yeah, that would. That's like contentment applied and paid forward, though, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why it's last on the list. So back to trust. I was just thinking while you were talking about that we're not very far into the scriptures when we get to Abram, and to us, Abraham is a patriarch, and of course, the kind of the beginning of the covenantal nature of man's relationship with God, but more specifically, that lesson teaches us there are degrees of trust. So if we were to ask anybody or someone to ask us, do you trust God? I think, our answer would very quickly be absolutely. And then, but the second question is begged, to what degree and how far?
Mm-hmm.
And so Abraham was tested by God, who asked him, will you trust me with your Isaac?
Mm-hmm.
His son, the son that God had promised to give he and Sarah in old age. And I won't go into the entire story, but, it was obvious that Abraham was willing to trust God with his son all the way to the end. And so...
But it had to be learned, though.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think we see that with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, is that each one of them, you can see God in their stories, in the Genesis account. You can see God growing their faith, getting that they trust him more and more. They say yes, and then they fail. And then they come back, and God gives them another test, and they do a little better, and then they fail again. And then ultimately, Abraham with Isaac on the mount, he passes the ultimate test. But it's a learn. Faith is, I think, faith is strengthened and learned through the sanctification process, just like I think trusting God is hand in hand with that. The more you trust God, the more faith that you have that his promises are true. He is faithful.
Mm.
And I think to kind of bring it to a more practical, everyday experience, when I shared my story about getting in the insurance business, the offer I was given was just ridiculously low. And it was like half of what my counterparts were making, and it was really a struggle. It's like, can I really believe that God is going to allow me to make a comfortable living and get married at some point and have a family and live on straight commission? So I think, this comes down to the actual practical everyday decision making. People are offered, opportunities with other companies, and it may be a larger income, it may be all kinds of extra benefits, but do we really pray through those things? Because it may not be what God wants.
Yeah.
So I think trusting God is tough because everything that glitters isn't gold. I just remember my brother-in-law mentioning to me his father was very successful in the building business and was offered this great position in another city, in another town, and quite a jump in income. And his father kept refusing those offers and said, he wanted to stay more local, raise his family in this particular area of town. And God honored that. Now, he could have made that choice, but it just wasn't the right choice for him. And so I think we need to really pray through these type of opportunities that come up, whether it be financially or professionally or whatever, and say, hey, really, what does God want me to do? What's the best decision I can make? What's the wise thing to do? Because the world's ways are almost the exact opposite of ways that God works.
The trust and the dependency on him. That's what your story reminds me of when my firstborn was being expected, and my wife and I both knew we wanted her to come home and be a full-time mom. But I had a job that was in finance, and I was going into commercial real estate and sales. And just like you, I had commission. Now, they were kind enough. They paid me $18,000 salary after getting a graduate degree and used to making a little bit more than that. But I remember just spending hours talking to God. It's like, I don't know if I can do this.
Mm-hmm.
Lord, how are we going to do this? I don't know how it's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Please, open door, show me where to go, because I don't know what to do. And it's that dependency. I was truly, truly dependent on him. I didn't have any answers.
Yeah, so it's not as easy as just saying, yes, I trust God,
Right.
or no, I don't trust God. It's more like, how are we willing to wait for God to work his will in his time, his way, rather than just run ahead and say, yeah, I trust God, but I also know how to take matters into my own hands. You know? And then we go attempt to solve things, and sometimes we think we do solve them, but we haven't solved them God's way, and so that misses a blessing, so to speak.
God never tells us to sin in the midst of being obedient to him.
Right.
Never.
And so you got this whole dynamic of covetousness and contentment about trusting God. And I had a thought while Ray was talking early on about how many people ask him, why do you keep driving that green Acura? He would roll up in that thing and park between a Cadillac Escalade and a Porsche at the men's outing events. And man, I just always admired Ray because he just rolled into that thing, and it was a witness to me. It was an inspiration to me about, that he had his boundaries. He calls them guardrails. Same thing, right? Yeah. But you did that for a reason, for what it's turned into, what was then and now is turned into what appears to me to be an even bigger blessing, by trusting God that maybe one day you will have a really nice car, but you got to tend to these other priorities first. How do you learn to be content driving a green Acura with 300,000 miles on it, right?
Well, I did wind up giving that away, but I now drive a 2004. I've upgraded 2004 Lexus with 183,000 miles. But I think I've always said, you know what? I don't really want to look at what other people do. I want to carve my own path, and I'm comfortable being my own person. And, not to say I'm not vulnerable to, looking to my right and to my left and seeing where everything stands, but I think you've got to be comfortable in your own skin and trusting God that this is your path. It may not be everybody else's path. I spend, like we've talked about earlier, I spend a lot of time through the day meeting with guys for breakfasts and lunches and dinners and discipling them, and it swallows up a lot of my time, but I love doing it. And I remember there was a football coach, Bobby Bowden, who used to speak at a lot of the Fellowship of Christian Athlete outings. And he was sharing about how during summertime, he would go out and give his testimony at all these different functions. And his wife said, Bobby, why do you spend all this time in the summer, traveling here and traveling there? You've got all the money you ever need. Why don't you just stay at home with me and just be comfortable and just kind of relax? And he said, honey, if I had the cure for cancer, I couldn't stop telling that story. He said, but honey, I've got something better than the cure of cancer. I know the answer to eternal life, and I can't stop talking about it. I'm like, whoa, that is a powerful story.
Yeah.
And so again, he was living a life that not many coaches of major colleges were living. And so I think God calls us to a unique pathway, and we have to be careful not to look to the right or to the left, because this is the pathway that God's called us to, whether it's looks normal to others or not. It's just something he's called us to, and we need to be obedient,
Powerful witness. And so we've got trust God. Then the second one, Duane, was
thank God.
Yeah.
Thank God for what you have, much or little, but be thankful. Truly be thankful to the Lord for the blessings that you have. The fact that any of us, I like to use the phrase, I'm better than I deserve. And I heard it here in the pulpit 30-something years ago, and it just resonated with me. And, we don't deserve much of anything. We're all sinners. We all fall short. And so being thankful over what you have, whether much or little, is a key attitude toward being content and learning to be content.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference, Duane, between being appreciative and being thankful?
I would say that truly being thankful is understanding that you really do not deserve anything, and that appreciating something is the act of being, proper etiquette or a little bit of humility. I acknowledge that, but being thankful is I really don't deserve anything.
Yeah, and so I think in the scriptures, when we are exhorted and we're reminded in a lot of different places, both directly and then through examples like the 10 lepers that were healed, only one came back and gave thanks. In the biblical sense, being thankful includes acknowledging the source.
Good point.
Acknowledging the source of the blessing, the healing, the deliverance, the provision, the peace, you name it. In other words, our posture to give thanks is an act of worship to give glory unto God, because I think the scripture that you keep referring to is every good and perfect thing comes from our Father in heaven above, who does not change. And so there is a source to our blessings, and there is an object, he who is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, who's worthy of our praise, that needs to be a part of our thanks.
Mm-hmm. One of my clients was the CFO at a large megachurch here in Atlanta. And I remember somehow we got talking about giving, and he said, I really think of my giving as an act of worship to the Lord. And I kind of double took, because I thought, I never really thought about giving as an act of worship. But he just kind of expanded on the fact of that's just something he feels that God has really prompted his heart, and he gives over and above, exceedingly above what you could ask or think as far as financially. And I just had never thought of that as an act of worship. But the more I do think about it, it really is, because it's giving of something that's been given to us. So it's kind of made me kind of think a different way as far as giving.
And so, we're into the conversation, and we're going to continue it. It'll obviously be in the next podcast as we kind of end our time for this one. But what a blessing it is for us to be able to consider, all right, to just pursue being content seems like a noble cause. But to understand that process from the biblical perspective, and those four elements, the two we've talked about today, trust and thanks, it's a wonderful opportunity to make a journey together, and accountability is welcomed and actually needed in that process too. So we'll pick up living in contentment, pursuing it, and those other two elements in the next podcast. Thanks for being with us today. We commend you to www.mountpisgah.org and the website there. You check us out. Feel free to come to worship. God bless.
Join us next time as we continue to learn to live life with open hearts and open hands as followers of Jesus Christ.